Thank you, everybody, for sticking with us through a distributed denial of PowerPoint attack. I think we all did all right. We made it through. I'm up here today to present Rising Tide Redux, Leviathan supply chain attacks, and kinetic naval intervention in the South China Sea. Next slide. So here's the glamour shot. That's a big picture of my face. My name is Michael Raggi. I am the staff threat research engineer at Proofpoint. And for anybody who's interested in some pretty good takes on nation-state activity, feel free to follow me on Twitter at Artaji. Next slide. So before I dive in today, I want to acknowledge some people that made this possible. So the Proofpoint Threat Insight team and the incredibly talented analysts I work with are a gift to work with every day. I want to acknowledge Sveva Senarelli at PwC for being my PIC and publishing some research on this group earlier this year. And then finally, some key members of the threat research community that have been mentors and sounding boards for me in being able to get this particular research to the stage. Next slide. Okay, so I'm a sucker for a pull quote, and seeing as I'm the guy with the microphone today, I hope you guys will indulge me. Two ships in the open sea without wind or tide at last will come together. Two enemies will inevitably meet. It is a question of time. Right now, this is the story in the South China Sea. As the People's Republic of China expands their influence navally, economically, and influence-wise in the region, increasingly, gray zone conflicts are being more and more common as sovereignty claims are competing in that area. Gray zone is meant to mean the space between peace and hot war. Basically, proxy activity that advances national interests without rising to the level of nation on nation or military on military conflict. And what I'm here to present today is what Proofpoint believes is an indication that Leviathan is supporting kinetic maritime intercession in the South China Sea region, with Leviathan acting as a supporting actor in phishing campaigns. So, next slide. So our agenda today, I'm going to cover who is Leviathan. I'm going to give you a brief history of sovereignty claims in the South China Sea, and then I'm going to provide a timeline of the phishing attacks that we're talking about, specifically targeting the supply chains of offshore energy in Malaysia and Taiwan. And this is my promise to you. By the end of this presentation, we will attempt to unmask what we believe to be the end intelligence customer that Leviathan is conducting these espionage campaigns on behalf. So that is not to say the MSS, don't worry, they show up prominently in this story, but really we're focusing on the end intelligence customers based on the collision of real-world kinetic events and cyber espionage events, or cyber war, if you will. And then finally, we're going to cover why Leviathan might be supporting these types of kinetic maritime operations in the region. So next slide. So who is Leviathan? Next slide. So Leviathan has been publicly attributed to the Chinese state. When I say publicly attributed, I'm referring to the US Department of Justice indictment from July 2021 that was made public, as well as some work by citizen hackers like Intrusion Truth. And this is a group that's been known as a number of different names by a lot of the different vendors in this room. They've been known as TA423, APT40, Red Ladon, Gadolinium, a lot of other names on the board as well. The US DOJ indictment, interestingly, attributed this group to the Hainan Regional Office of the Ministry of State Security. That is the procurement entity that was procuring an information technology based in Hainan, China, called the Hainan Zhandu Technology Development Company. That's all in the indictment. Interestingly, that indictment details at length their operations from 2011, but really 2015 to 2019, largely targeting the South China Sea region, Malaysia, Taiwan, a little bit of Oceania, Australia, a lot of other countries that didn't make the slide, primarily conducting espionage and intellectual property theft. Next slide. So here are four of the handsome gentlemen that were indicted as part of the US DOJ indictment. You'll notice Leviathan was one of the monikers included by the US DOJ in the indictment, as well as the Hainan Zhandu Technology Development Company. Interestingly, they outed a number of the operators responsible for the computer network intrusions, as well as the MSS officer and handler that was working with the Hainan office of the MSS, which is Ding Xiaoyang, the gent in the glasses. Next slide. So drilling down on the indictment, it becomes apparent really quickly what their focus is. If you control F for maritime research and development, you get a lot of highlighting really, really fast. This particular group's stock and trade was the targeting of global entities in the US and elsewhere for naval and maritime research, as well as intellectual property theft around naval technology that might give them a battlefield or technology advantage eventually. Next slide. So why are they so obsessed with boats? Next slide. So specifically, the answer there might be geographic. We've covered that the Leviathan group is operating in tandem with the Hainan Ministry of State Security. The Ministry of State Security has different offices that are set up based on province. So there are many provinces in China, like there are states in the United States, and many of those have offices regionally of the MSS. Additionally, they serve regional needs that exist within Hainan province. So, based on the DOJ indictment and the address included for the Hainan Zandun Technology Development Company, we are aware that they are operating out of Haikou, the central dot on that map, operating in the north side of Hainan Island. To the north of Haikou is Zhanjiang, and specifically the port of Zhanjiang, which is where the PLA Navy South Fleet is docked. So think all of the above water boats are going to be operating in the South China Sea and docking in the port of Zhanjiang. To the south of this contractor is the suburb of Sanya, and in Sanya exists the Yunlin Naval Base, which is where all the submarines below the water are docking. So they are particularly geographically well placed to serve the naval needs of the MSS in the province of Hainan. Next slide. So now we're going to do a brief history of sovereignty claims in the South China Sea. Next slide. Okay, so since 2009, the Chinese Communist Party made a very broad and public claim, colloquially referred to as the Chinese 9-line claim, in which they espouse sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters, as well as the seabed and subsoil thereof. So it's not just the water and the islands they're interested in, it's the subsoil. And what's in the subsoil? Minerals, hydrocarbon, energy. So they're not only saying we own the water, they're saying we own the right to develop the energy under the water and in the seabed. And you'll notice China's not the only one with a sovereignty claim in the South China Sea. You'll notice that Malaysia has a claim, Vietnam has a claim, Brunei has a claim, Philippines, other nations as well, and often they are in conflict with each other, overlapping. And within those overlapping areas, especially the Chinese 9-line, gray zone conflict is becoming more common. And we're going to tell a story today about one of those gray zone conflicts, specifically off the shore of Malaysia, and then later in March 2022, in which we observed the supply chain of a Taiwanese offshore wind farm that was targeted as well by the Leviathan threat actor. Next slide. Okay, so now a timeline of Leviathan phishing events. Next slide. So the primary period of activity that we've observed Leviathan conducting phishing campaigns is from June 2021 through June 2022, actually a little bit after June 2022 as well. From the period of June 21 through April of 2022, we observed them utilizing phishing attachments, specifically RTF attachments leveraging RTF template injection. Subsequently, in April 2022, they kind of changed tactics, instead referring to URLs that ultimately redirected to deliver the Scambox JavaScript network profiling framework. Interestingly, I previously said that the US Department of Justice released their indictment in July 2021. You can look at the timeline. The tempo and operational pace, as well as the TTPs, did not change as dramatically as you would think they would have. The operations kind of persisted through that period, regardless of the public disclosure of that indictment. Next slide. So today, for the purposes of this conversation, we're really going to drill down on two snapshots of campaigns in which energy projects in the South China Sea were targeted. We're going to speak about an operation that targeted an offshore hydrocarbon entity off the coast of Malaysia on June 2nd, 2021, and the targeting of the Taiwanese supply chain. And when I say supply chain, it's an individual in Europe that is a key vendor for an offshore wind farm in the Strait of Taiwan in late March 2022, both using RTF template injection. Next slide. So when I say RTF template injection, I find it incredibly helpful to visualize these sorts of attacks. What we observed varied slightly between June through March 2022, but this gives you a good idea of approximately what they were doing in that time period. So it begins with a phishing email. That phishing email contains an RTF attachment, and within that RTF attachment, when you open it, in the file there is a template field that contains a URL, or a control word group for any of the nerds who are obsessed with RTF files like me. Within that RTF file, that URL calls out to an actor delivery server, and that actor delivery server has, the request specifically has a victim-specific ID that is hard-coded, which will give the actor an indication of who specifically clicked the URL. After that time, a malicious zip archive will be returned from a server response and written to the host. Once executed, that malicious zip archive, once extracted, contains a legitimate PE file and a DLL malware stager. That DLL malware stager is executed through DLL search order hijacking, a very Chinese technique that most of the people will recognize in this room. And then upon execution, it will call out to a command and control server, ultimately pulling down an XOR encoded shellcode. Once decrypted and executed, it's Meterpreter, and you have an infection on your machine. So, next slide. So how do we know this is Leviathan? Rather than just asking you guys to trust me on the stage because they gave me a microphone, we want to share a little bit of our thoughts around attribution, how we came to the conclusion. So, next slide. So firstly, the RTF template injection technique is kind of interesting and unique the way that they are implementing it. There are other APT actors and crimeware actors using RTF template injection, but the way in which they are embedding their control word groups, or basically the template field, you can kind of put it anywhere in your file. They love to smush it in between font families and include it in the same word group. It's a weird thing that's consistent. I've only seen them doing it, and I think it's likely they have a builder that just keeps stuffing it in the same place. The other Chinese group I'm aware of does something very different. So that's the first thing. Next slide. The use of hard-coded victim-specific IDs as a means for deconflicting infections of targets is something we see by many actors, but in combination with RTF template injection where they're not specifying specific file resources, that's unique to Leviathan. Next slide. This basket of TTPs using RTF template injection to pull down a XOR encoded shellcode through a zip archive containing a DLL malware stager, that's also very, very Leviathan in its nature. Specifically, the legitimate PEs and other payloads that were loaded by that PE in the past, if you trace them back through enough campaigns, eventually you'll land at the dad stash campaigns that were publicly published in the past by some really talented researchers that helped me along the way to this conclusion. And then next slide. Finally, the sector victimology and the geographic focus, targeting Malaysia, targeting Oceania, Australia, naval defense, and South China Sea issues is very, very well aligned with Leviathan's victimology in the past. Next slide. Okay, so let me now deliver you guys the hook. Never in my career have I observed a cyber espionage campaign, cyber warfare campaign, and a kinetic operation coalescing in a way that allowed me to make a broader conclusion, not only about attribution, not only about procurement in the MSS, but about who the end intelligence customer is that is using the intelligence. And what I'm about to present, this story, is largely what allowed us to come to that conclusion overall. Next slide. So, June 2nd, 2021, we see a Leviathan phishing campaign, the one I just described to you. It looks like Leviathan, we recognize it as Leviathan, but it is not immediately apparent to us what they're doing and why these targets are deviating from their usual naval defense type targets. We saw natural gas targets, we saw construction, banking, subsea engineering, and conventional engineering. And it took us moments to really drill down on the recipients and understand what they all had in common. Next slide. What they all had in common was the Kasawari gas field. For those not familiar with the Kasawari gas field, it is one of the largest offshore energy projects in the world, specifically in the South China Sea, off of the shore of Malaysia. And interestingly, the project was supposed to come online in 2023, but construction began on the platform just one day before this phishing campaign on June 1st, 2021. So what we observed the day after construction in this contested waters within the Malaysian claim was a phishing campaign going up and down the supply chain of this gas project, specifically targeting entities that may or may not have knowledge about who's operating at that given site. Next slide. So enhance, I'm a big fan of maps. Here is specifically where the Malaysian Kasawari gas field is located. It's right off of the shore of Sarawak in Malaysia. And I'm exposing as well the same map I showed you earlier, now with a tiny golden box on it to show you where it is within the sovereignty claim of the Chinese 9-dash line, of the Malaysian sovereign claim, and it's also right butt up against the Bruneian claim. So one would imagine that if you are the Chinese Communist Party who has asserted your sovereign right to not only the waters and the islands, but everything underneath it, if a country within the 9-dash line is developing energy rights underneath what you believe to be the sovereign right of China, you may have an issue with it, and you may take some sort of action against it. Next slide. So at the beginning, I teased a fairly big unveiling of not only Leviathan and the MSS, but who the end customer is. Next slide. So bear with me for a second. Thinking about, again, the US Department of Justice indictments, we've established that the Hainan Ministry of State Security procured the Hainan Zandun Technology Development Company, or Leviathan, to conduct espionage on their behalf, targeting naval intelligence and research. They stole designs. And you would think Leviathan steals the designs and they pass it off to the MSS. Job well done, we did it. But the MSS doesn't employ engineers. They don't have guys with AutoCAD software and wrenches. They need to then redistribute that intelligence through other Chinese state organs or contractors that would be able to reverse engineer a submarine plan. That's not based on any knowledge, I'm just making something up. So in this case, who would benefit in real time from supply chain and operational data from a Kasawari gas field days after it was first constructed? Here it is, next slide. The Chinese Coast Guard. And the reason we know that is because 2 days after the phishing campaign and 3 days after construction began on the site, the Chinese Coast Guard showed up on site and began harassing pipe-laying barges and private vessels responsible for the construction of the initial gas pipeline project. Next slide. So expanding on this timeline of maritime intercession, June 1st, project begins. Chinese Air Force buzzes the site because we're not happy about it, we're gonna let you know, and very publicly broadcasted that this is something that China will resist. June 2nd, the Proofpoint campaign is identified, targeting up and down the supply chain. June 4th, Chinese Coast Guard arrives. They remain active and operating at the site, harassing private vessels through Q3 and Q4 2021, which is the first phase of construction at that given site. Notably, on July 3rd, the very definition of gray zone conflict happened. A second pipe-laying barge was arriving at that site, which would significantly expedite the process of construction, as well as a number of different supply barges. So interestingly, on that day, the Chinese Coast Guard sailed within several hundred yards of those boats, not escalating to armed conflict, but directly degrading the capability to operate on site and advance the project. And China, in that context, was advancing a national interest within the gray zone without engaging in active armed conflict. Next slide. But here's the kicker. This is not the only time that the Chinese Coast Guard has done this. They do this a bunch. On the top left, we see the article about the Kasawari gas site from Radio Free Asia. Underneath that, on August 11th, a couple of months after what we observed in June, the same Chinese Coast Guard ship shows up in Indonesia at the tuna gas block, harasses vessels there. And then most recently, there was an article published in June 2022 in which a Taiwanese research ship carrying Filipino researchers was harassed. When I say research, hear hydrocarbon exploration. They're looking for the next Kasawari gas field. Next slide. So what we have here now is a pattern in which we are observing the Chinese Coast Guard harassing offshore energy sites and enforcing sovereignty within the South China Sea. To take it back to what Proofpoint observed specifically, in late March 2022, we observed another RTF template injection campaign, and it had a victim-specific ID, and it delivered Meterpreter. This is what we would expect to see from this actor, except this time, it targeted a European manufacturer of heavy equipment, specifically a very niche piece of equipment that was required for the installation of offshore wind farms off the coast of Taiwan. Interestingly, at the time period that this particular entity was targeted, it was a period of uncertainty on the site. They had financing issues. It wasn't sure when the site would have the resumption of construction. But what we're seeing is Leviathan showing up in key development lifecycle periods of energy projects to gather intelligence about operational realities for construction at those sites. Next slide. So here's a visualization of the entire Taiwanese offshore wind farm ecosystem. The Yunlin wind farm is the southernmost of that particular cluster, highlighted with the yellow arrow. And for context, I've compared this against the Chinese military drill sites around the island of Taiwan, which occurred in August 2022 following the US House Speaker's visit to Taiwan. For anyone that is also familiar with the prognosticated possible amphibious landing sites in the island of Taiwan, basically any of those sites on the western side of Taiwan, you gotta go through the wind farm fields to get there. So it is well documented that both the PLA Navy and the Chinese Coast Guard regularly patrol the Strait of Taiwan, as it is a very high trafficked area, and having intelligence about operational realities of people constructing wind turbines might be something that's really useful to you, being the Chinese Coast Guard. Next slide. Okay, so wrapping this up, we've answered a lot of our questions, a lot of the who, the what, the when, the how, but why? Why Leviathan and why the Chinese Coast Guard? Next slide. So the answer, as it often is in China, is it's the law. In January 2021, the Chinese Coast Guard law was passed in China. And this emboldened and elevated the status of the Chinese Coast Guard to be the sovereign enforcer of claims in the South China Sea. Not only were they responsible for protecting the islands and the claims, they also were responsible now for the exploration and development of marine mineral resources. Further, they were empowered to supervise, inspect, investigate, and punish illegal acts by foreign-related marine scientific research within the scope of their duties. That sounds a lot like hydrocarbon exploration. That sounds a lot like we're building an oil platform in the South China Sea. So that's why the Chinese Coast Guard, realistically, they got a new mandate in January. They then needed to stand up the capability to patrol in the South China Sea. They were referred, I can't say for sure, possibly to the Ministry of State Security. And they said, hey, we need some intelligence about boats. And they said, oh, we got guys who do boats. We got Leviathan. So next slide. Leviathan has a proven track record for targeting maritime research and development. Interestingly, and the takeaway that I want to leave you with is they might not be conducting this particular espionage research for battlefield superiority. I think instead, this might possibly be a deconfliction activity, where they are interested in supporting gray zone operations. They are not interested in naval conflict. They want to know who's operating at the site, and possibly, is the Malaysian Navy going to show up today? So I think by being able to conduct this espionage operation, they are capable of keeping it in the gray zone, as well as advancing the sovereign claim of China in the South China Sea without rising to the level of kinetic conflict. So this type of research is challenging. It takes a lot of people and some really incredible minds to do a year long of research and bring it public. And I believe that organizations like ours and yours out there have the ability to tell these long arc stories, taking kinetic events and cyber warfare and coming away with a larger conclusion. And if you do it publicly enough, you too, next slide, can be told by the Chinese Communist Party spokesperson that you have no professionalism or credibility, which is what happened to me on August 31st. When journalists asked the Chinese Communist Party spokesperson what they thought of our blog. So don't worry, guys, it has an impact. And with that, next slide, I'm happy to take any questions we have left.
You mentioned in your timeline that on June 1st, with the Kesselwagen oil field incident, or gas field incident, that the PLA-AF was involved. They were buzzing. This was a whole of government approach, right? There were multiple agencies, multiple parts of the Chinese government that were involved. Is it possible that a lot of that timeline could be explained by coincidence, overhead imagery? Is there anything that you've seen from the cyber perspective that more directly ties something that they collected in the supply chain, say shipping manifest, that directly informs something that couldn't have come from other sources, so to speak? Is it possible that the MSS was very active, but kind of just a distraction and didn't really help that much, even though they were trying?
Sure. So structurally, traditionally, PLA units in China and MSS support for cyber operations in China support different organizations. So the expectation is likely that the PLA support for an operation would have come from a more regionally tasked group that has different APT names that don't necessarily align with Leviathan as the MSS. Specifically about what we saw being stolen, nothing. We stopped it. So in that particular case, we did not have the actions after to make an assessment about what information might have been correlated or taken. Largely, a lot of these conclusions are based on the victimology and understanding the roles of individuals that are targeted and their professional realities that might impact intelligence that might be worth extracting from their emails.
Hi, how are you able to rule out the alternative hypothesis that Leviathan and the Coast Guard are just receiving shared priorities and tasking from the same source rather than the Coast Guard being the designated ultimate customer of this collection?
I'm sorry, I just had a little trouble understanding you that time.
So, as an alternative hypothesis, how are you able to rule out the possibility that the Coast Guard isn't the intended ultimate customer for the collect, but Leviathan and the Coast Guard are receiving tasking and priorities from the same source?
So that's interesting. How was I able to rule it out? I said we probably weren't able to exclusively rule that out. I think we have an understanding that the Ministry of State Security is acting as the procurement entity. The operational realities and the consistency of campaigns over time that had impact on multiple projects allowed us to make a conclusion about the consistency of targeting and the possible impact of what they were doing. So if we're speaking only of the June campaign, sure, that's a very small data set. I highlighted 2 use cases today, but we have a year of data where we were doing every other day notifications about this particular adversary. So we have a very good understanding and working definition of what was happening operationally in the region correlated to real-time cyber espionage campaigns over phishing. So the larger picture over time helped us build out this pattern rather than just the kind of very polished screenshots we presented today. All right, thank you guys.